I'm Grandpa Harry. Pull up a chair. I've learned that some family fights don't end with slammed doors or broken plates. Some end with silence so long it starts to feel like furniture. This one started on a Thanksgiving when the turkey was dry. The gravy smelled like pepper and onions, and everyone was already a little tired of pretending. My son was sitting across from me, elbows on the table like he was still 15, not 32. I said something sharp about his job, the kind of comment you think is helpful because you've paid bills longer than he's been alive. He snapped back. His voice cracked. The room went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I remember the smell of burnt rolls and the way his mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. He stood up, said he needed air, and walked out into the cold. The door shut softer than it should have. That was the last sound I heard from him for years. I called. I wrote. I even drove past his old apartment once, feeling foolish sitting in the car with my hands on the steering wheel. Leather cracked and sticky under my palms. People tell you to give it time. Time doesn't heal much. It just teaches you how to live with the ache. If this kind of story feels close to home, don't rush away. Sit with me. Sometimes listening is the only way families find their way back, even if the path is crooked. Years later, when my knees complained on stairs and coffee tasted better black, I got a call from a public defender's office. They asked if I could bring some documents to the courthouse. They said it involved a property issue from years back, nothing serious. I said yes, because saying yes felt like being useful again. The courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper. The floors were cold through my shoes. When I stepped up to security, I emptied my pockets into a gray plastic bin. Keys, wallet, loose change that clinked like nervous laughter. I walked through the metal detector. It beeped. The guard waved me back, polite but firm. I felt heat creep up my neck. He pointed to the bin and asked about a small envelope I didn't remember packing. Inside were photocopies of documents I hadn't seen in years, papers tied to that Thanksgiving argument, papers I had signed without reading closely enough because I trusted my son to handle the details. As I stood there, the machine quiet now, I understood something that made my mouth go dry. The fight wasn't about respect or jobs or pride. It was about protection. He had walked away so I wouldn't have to stand where I was standing now. I didn't know if that made me proud or ashamed, maybe both. I still don't know. I sat on a hard bench outside the courtroom, the vinyl cold against the backs of my legs. The air buzzed with murmurs and the squeak of shoes on tile. I kept rubbing my thumb over a crease in those papers, feeling the raised ink like a scar. The argument replayed in my head, but different now. I remembered his eyes that night, not angry like I'd told myself, but scared. I had mistaken fear for disrespect. That's an easy mistake when you're used to being the loudest voice in the room. When they finally called my name, I stood up slower than I used to. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and coffee. The judge spoke calmly, like this was just another Tuesday. To me, it felt like someone had lifted a floorboard in my life and shown me what was rotting underneath. I learned that my son had taken responsibility for something that should have been shared. He had cut me out so I wouldn't be dragged through hearings and headlines. Silence was his shield. Mine too, whether I wanted it or not. I walked out afterward into the sunlight, squinting, the noise of traffic too loud. I wanted to call him right then. I didn't. I went home instead and sat at the kitchen table where that Thanksgiving had unraveled. The table still had a nick on the edge from when he was a kid, slamming a toy truck too hard. I don't know if I did the right thing back then or now. All I know is that love doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like distance you didn't ask for. If you've ever wondered whether an argument was really about what was said, you're probably right. There's almost always another room in the house you didn't walk into. The ground is set. Shall we continue with the next chapter of the truth? I didn't sleep much that night. The house made too many noises when everything else went quiet. The clock in the hallway ticked like it was counting down something I didn't understand yet. I kept smelling sage and butter, even though Thanksgiving had been years ago, like the walls themselves remembered better than I did. The next morning I woke up before dawn, joints stiff, mouth dry. Coffee tasted burnt, but I drank it anyway, standing at the sink, staring out at a yard that needed raking. Normal things. That's what scared me. Life had kept going while something unfinished sat between me and my son like an unpaid debt. I picked up the phone at least 3 times, put it back down every time. Pride is a funny thing. It tells you it's protecting your dignity when really it's just scared of being rejected again. Around mid-morning, the public defender called. She said the paperwork was mostly settled, that no further action was needed from me. Her voice was kind, professional. Before hanging up, she said something that stuck. She said, "Your son didn't want you involved because he was afraid it would break your heart." I laughed, a short, ugly sound, as if hearts come with warranties at my age. I decided to drive. No announcement, no phone call, just drive. The road out of town smelled like wet asphalt and pine, the kind of smell that used to mean camping trips when my son was small and still trusted me with directions. I kept both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, radio off. Silence felt more honest. His building hadn't changed much, same chipped steps, same dented mailbox that never quite closed. I sat in the car for a long minute, feeling the worn fabric of the seat under my fingers, listening to my own breathing. I thought about turning around. That thought came easy. Too easy. When I knocked, it took a while. I heard movement inside, a chair scraping, the deadbolt sliding back slow, cautious. When the door opened, he looked older than I expected. Not in the gray hair way, in the eyes. They were tired in a way you don't get from long workdays alone. He didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just stood there, hand still on the knob, like he wasn't sure whether to open the door wider or close it forever. "I know," I said. It wasn't planned. It just came out. My voice sounded rough, like I'd swallowed gravel. He stared at me, then looked past my shoulder down the stairs, checking for someone else. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Not angry, worried. "That's what you said in a different way years ago," I replied. I could hear my heart in my ears. I didn't listen then either. He stepped aside. The apartment smelled like old books and lemon cleaner, familiar and not. We sat at a small table, knees almost touching. He poured coffee without asking, hands steady. That told me something. He'd practiced being calm. We didn't start with apologies. We started with weather, traffic, nonsense. 2 men circling the real thing like it might bite. Finally, I told him about the courthouse, about the metal detector, about the envelope. His shoulders sagged a little, like he'd been holding them up for years. "I didn't want you dragged into it," he said. "You'd already done enough." There it was. Enough. The word hung heavy between us. I realized then how much of my life I'd spent confusing control with care, signing papers because I trusted him, then criticizing him for handling things his own way, teaching him independence and punishing him for using it. "I was wrong," I said. 3 words. They tasted strange but solid, like stepping onto ground you weren't sure would hold. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded once. Not forgiveness, not yet. Understanding, maybe. Or permission to keep talking. He told me the rest. About the legal mess. About how that Thanksgiving argument had pushed him to make a decision faster than he wanted. About how walking away felt easier than explaining something that would make me disappointed. I wanted to tell him disappointment had nothing to do with it. Fear did. But I kept quiet. Listening was overdue. When I left, the sun was low, painting the buildings orange and tired. We hadn't hugged. We hadn't promised anything. But he had said, "Call next time," instead of, "Don't come back." At my age, you learn to recognize progress even when it's small. Driving home, my hands felt lighter on the wheel. The road hummed under the tires. I thought about that Thanksgiving table, the dry turkey, the silence after the door closed. I thought about how many times I'd replayed that night, editing it in my favor. Here's the part that still twists me up. If I could go back, I don't know if I'd change what I said. Not completely. Some lessons only land when they hurt. But I would change how I listened. I would notice fear sooner. I would ask questions instead of making statements. Old men like me love to hand out advice. Truth is, most of what I know came from getting it wrong first. Family doesn't fracture in one loud moment. It cracks quietly, decision by decision, until a metal detector beeps and you realize you've been carrying something sharp for years. I don't know how this ends yet. Maybe we find our way back to noisy holidays. Maybe we don't. Some bridges get rebuilt as footpaths, not highways. You take what you can cross safely. That night, back in my kitchen, I made a sandwich with leftover bread and too much mustard. I ate standing up, the way I always do when my thoughts are loud. The house still made its noises. The clock still ticked. But for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space, and sometimes space is where understanding finally fits. A week passed before I called him. I waited longer than I should have, telling myself I was giving him room, when really I was testing whether the door was actually open or if I'd imagined it. When he answered, there was a pause on the line, the faint sound of traffic behind him. Then he said my name, not Dad, just my name, and for some reason that felt honest. We met at a diner halfway between our places. Same one we used to stop at when he was a teenager, back when he'd order pancakes at dinner time just to irritate his mother. The place smelled like grease and coffee that had been sitting too long. Vinyl booths cracked and patched with duct tape. Real life smells. I liked that. He was already there, stirring his coffee even though the sugar had long dissolved. I slid into the booth across from him, feeling the grit under my fingers on the tabletop. We nodded at each other like two men who'd shared a storm and weren't sure if it was over. This time, the conversation went deeper, slower. He talked about the years I wasn't around, not because I didn't try, but because he didn't let me. He said carrying the responsibility alone had aged him. I could see it now, in the way he sighed before certain sentences, like he'd learned to brace himself before telling the truth. I told him about my side, too, about the nights I'd pour a drink and stare at the phone, about the shame of explaining to friends that I didn't really know where my son was or what he was doing, about how silence can make a man rewrite history just to survive it. There was a moment, somewhere between refilling coffee cups and the clatter of dishes, when he asked me something I didn't expect. He asked if I was angry about the legal mess, about the risk I could have faced if things had gone differently. I thought about it. Anger would have been easier, cleaner. Anger gives you somewhere to point. What I felt instead was regret, thick and slow, like syrup. Regret that I'd raised a son smart enough to fix problems and stubborn enough not to ask for help. Regret that I'd taught him strength without teaching him softness. I'm angry at myself, I said finally. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. I should have been safer with my trust and gentler with my words. He nodded, eyes on his coffee. That nod meant more than any apology could have. We talked about the future, cautiously. No big plans, just small, reasonable things. A phone call now and then, maybe dinner once a month. He said he didn't know if he could ever go back to loud family holidays. I told him that was fine. Traditions aren't sacred. People are. When we stood to leave, he hesitated, then reached out and put a hand on my arm. Not a hug. Something sturdier. Acknowledgement. I felt it all the way down to my shoes. Driving home, I realized something uncomfortable. Part of me had enjoyed being the wounded father. It gave my loneliness a story, a reason people could nod at. Letting go of that meant accepting my own role fully, without the cushion of martyrdom. Growth doesn't just hurt when it starts. It hurts when it works. That night, I dug out an old photo album. The kind with plastic sheets that stick to your fingers. There was a picture of him at 8 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a fish he was afraid to touch. I remembered how he'd looked at me then, waiting to see if I'd be proud or disappointed. That look never really goes away. It just gets better at hiding. I thought about how easily a single argument can become a symbol for everything that was never said. Thanksgiving wasn't the cause. It was the spark that landed on dry wood we'd stacked for years. A few days later, I got a letter from the courthouse. Final confirmation that everything was closed. No more loose ends. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer I rarely open. Some chapters don't need rereading. I don't pretend we're fixed. Families aren't appliances. They're more like old houses. You repair one thing and another creaks somewhere else. But now, when the house makes noise at night, it doesn't sound empty anymore. It sounds lived in. The hardest lesson I've learned this late in life is that being right is cheap compared to being close. I held onto my certainty like it was a shield, not realizing it was also a wall. Taking it down didn't make me weaker. It made room. When I think back to that metal detector beep, I don't hear it as an alarm anymore. I hear it as a signal. Something saying, stop carrying this alone. Stop pretending silence is peace. I don't know what kind of father I'll be going forward. I do know what kind I won't be. I won't be the man who mistakes volume for authority or distance for respect. If there's time left, and I believe there is, I plan to use it listening. Some truths wait decades to surface. Not because they're hidden well, but because we aren't ready to see them. I was ready that day, standing in a courthouse, pockets emptied, finally light enough to move forward. Time has a way of testing whether good intentions are real or just emotional weather. Weeks turned into months. We kept our word mostly. Short calls, uneventful dinners, nothing dramatic. At first that disappointed me. I'd grown used to thinking reconciliation needed fireworks. Turns out it prefers steady light. One evening he asked if I'd help him clean out a storage unit he'd been paying for since before the silence. I said yes without asking what was inside. The place smelled like dust and motor oil. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making everything look slightly sick. We rolled up the metal door and there it all was. Old furniture, boxes of paperwork. A few things I recognized immediately, and a few I didn't. He handed me a box labeled in my handwriting. That caught me off guard. Inside were letters I'd written him during those quiet years. Unopened, still sealed. My chest tightened. I'd imagined him reading them late at night, weighing whether to forgive me. The truth was simpler and harder. He hadn't been ready to hear my voice at all. I couldn't read them, he said, watching my face carefully. If I did, I might have come back before I could stand on my own. I nodded. That made sense. Independence sometimes needs distance the way bones need time to set. You interfere too early and everything heals crooked. As we worked, we found things that belonged to neither of us anymore. Old tax files, a broken lamp, an envelope with my name on it that I didn't remember writing. Inside was a single sentence, written by him years ago, never sent. It said he hoped one day we'd talk without trying to win. That sentence stayed with me. It still does. Winning had always felt important. Being understood felt optional. Somewhere along the way, those priorities flipped. When we finished, we stood outside in the late afternoon heat, sweat drying on our backs, the air smelling like sun-baked asphalt. He asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I said yes. Simple as that. No symbolism, no ceremony. Just two men hungry after work. Over burgers and fries, he asked about my health. I told him the truth. Some aches, nothing urgent. He listened without interrupting. That was new. Or maybe I'd never noticed before. Then he told me something he hadn't told many people. He said the years without me had taught him how strong he was, but also how lonely strength can be. That's when I realized something important. The silence had changed us both. I wasn't the only one who'd paid for it. We had each carried our own version of the cost, quietly, stubbornly, convinced we were protecting the other. On the drive home, I thought about all the parents who think authority means having the final word. It doesn't. It means knowing when to stop talking. If you're lucky, you learn that before the metal detector beeps. We aren't close in the way we once were. I don't think we ever will be, and that's all right. What we have now is honest. Less noise, fewer assumptions, more room to breathe. Sometimes he calls me Dad again. Sometimes he doesn't. I don't correct him. Here's the part I don't say out loud very often. If that argument had never happened, if Thanksgiving had passed quietly, we might have kept drifting with the same unspoken habits until something worse broke us. Pain doesn't always arrive to punish. Sometimes it arrives to interrupt. I still don't know if I handled everything the right way. I probably didn't. But I know this. I stopped pretending I was blameless, and I stopped demanding forgiveness on my timeline. That alone changed the direction of things. If you're listening to this and thinking about someone you haven't spoken to in too long, I won't tell you to call them today. That kind of advice sounds good and fails often. What I will say is this. Take an honest look at what you're carrying. Some things feel lighter once you admit they were never meant to be carried alone. I'm an old man now. I've learned that most family rifts aren't about love disappearing. They're about fear piling up. Fear of disappointment, fear of losing control, Fear of finding out we were wrong. The beep at that courthouse didn't accuse me. It woke me up. If this story kept you company for a while, I'm glad. These aren't performances to me. They're just memories with the dust blown off. Stick around if you want. There are more truths like this, some heavier, some gentler, all earned the hard way. And if nothing else, take this as one old man's 2 cents. Winning an argument feels good for an evening. Keeping your people when you can feels good for the rest of your life.